In the mid-19th century, North America was a land of untamed wilderness, burgeoning cities, and a growing sense of manifest destiny. The United States, a young nation of immigrants and pioneers, was bursting at the seams with a desire to expand, to conquer new lands, and to fulfill what many believed was its God-given right to stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific. However, this land was not empty. To the south lay Mexico, a nation rich in history, culture, and land, but weakened by internal strife and political instability. Only 2 decades had passed since Mexico had won its independence from Spain, and already the new nation found itself grappling with a complex identity and external pressures. As the U.S. pushed westward, tensions grew between these two neighbors, one ascending in power, the other struggling to maintain its territory. The seeds of conflict were sown in the fertile lands of Texas, where American settlers, drawn by promises of land and opportunity, began to outnumber the native Mexican population. These settlers, known as Texians, brought with them their own customs, language, and a fierce independence that clashed with Mexican laws and governance. The situation was further complicated by the issue of slavery, abolished in Mexico but practiced by many Texian settlers. In 1836, these tensions erupted into open conflict. The Texians, rebelling against Mexican rule, declared their independence, sparking the Texas Revolution. The battles that followed, from the siege of the Alamo to the victory at San Jacinto, were fierce and bloody. The newly declared Republic of Texas stood victorious but precarious, its independence recognized by few and acknowledged reluctantly by Mexico. Back in Washington, D.C., the fate of Texas became a hotly debated issue. President James K. Polk, an ardent supporter of expansion, saw in Texas not just an opportunity to add new territory to the Union, but a stepping stone toward acquiring the vast, fertile lands of California and New Mexico. However, annexing Texas was no simple matter. It was a move that would almost certainly lead to war with Mexico. Meanwhile, in Mexico City, the government viewed the annexation of Texas as a direct violation of its sovereignty, an affront that could not go unanswered. The boundary between Texas and Mexico had never been clearly defined, and now, with U.S. troops moving into the disputed region, the stage was set for a confrontation. In April 1846, the first shots were fired near the Rio Grande, in a skirmish that left American soldiers dead on contested soil. This was the spark that ignited the Mexican-American War. President Polk, eager for a justification to go to war, declared to Congress that American blood had been shed on American soil, a rallying cry that resonated with a nation hungry for expansion. War was declared on May 13, 1846. The United States, with its superior resources and military organization, seemed poised for an easy victory. But the war that followed would be anything but easy. It was a conflict that would test the resolve of both nations, bring out the best and worst in their leaders, and leave a lasting mark on the continent. The war began with a series of campaigns in northern Mexico, led by General Zachary, a seasoned military leader who quickly earned the nickname Old Rough and Ready for his unpretentious style and tough demeanor. Taylor's forces, though smaller in number, were better equipped and more disciplined than the Mexican army, which was plagued by poor leadership and low morale. At the Battle of Palo Alto, Taylor's artillery proved decisive, inflicting heavy casualties on the Mexican forces. The battle was a clear victory for the United States and set the tone for the early stages of the war. But the Mexican troops, though retreating, were not defeated. They regrouped and made a stand at Resaca de la Palma, where Taylor's forces once again emerged victorious after fierce fighting. For the Mexican soldiers, these defeats were demoralizing, but they also steeled their resolve. They were defending their homeland, their families, and their way of life against a foreign invader. And for many, this was a cause worth dying for. The war took on a new intensity as both sides dug in for what would become a long and grueling conflict. Taylor's next target was the city of Monterrey, a key stronghold in northern Mexico. The battle that ensued was one of the most brutal of the war, as American forces fought street by street, house by house, to take control of the city. The Mexican defenders, outnumbered and outgunned, nevertheless put up a fierce resistance. The siege lasted for days, with heavy casualties on both sides. When Monterrey finally fell, it was a Pyrrhic victory for the United States. The city was in ruins and the costs in lives had been high. But the victory solidified Taylor's reputation as a national hero and brought the U.S. one step closer to its ultimate goal, Mexico City. While battles raged on land, the war also extended to the seas. The U.S. Navy, with its superior ships and experienced sailors, quickly established blockades along the Mexican coast, cutting off vital supplies and putting additional pressure on the Mexican government. But the war at sea was not just about blockades. It was also about conquest. California, with its vast lands and strategic coastline, was a prize the United States had coveted for years. The Mexican presence in California was relatively weak, and when U.S. forces arrived, they encountered little organized resistance. The Bear Flag Revolt, a short-lived rebellion by American settlers in California, had already set the stage for a U.S. takeover. On June 14, 1846, American settlers in Sonoma declared the California Republic, raising a crude flag featuring a grizzly bear and a star. Though the Republic lasted only a few weeks before U.S. forces took control, the bear flag became a symbol of American expansion and the belief in manifest destiny. Despite the relatively easy conquest of Northern California, the campaign in Southern California proved more difficult. The Battle of San Pasqual, fought in December 1846, was one of the few battles in which Mexican forces had the upper hand, using guerrilla tactics to inflict heavy casualties on U.S. troops. But the U.S. forces, led by General Stephen W. Kearny, eventually regrouped and, with reinforcements, captured Los Angeles in January 1847. The conquest of California was complete, but the region remained a complex and multicultural society. The war had brought dramatic change, but it would be years before California was fully integrated into the United States. For the Mexican residents, known as Californios, the war marked the beginning of a long struggle to maintain their land, culture, and identity in the face of American domination. While Taylor continued his campaigns in northern Mexico, the U.S. government, eager to end the war quickly, turned its attention to central Mexico. The plan was ambitious, an amphibious assault on Veracruz, followed by a march on Mexico City, the heart of the Mexican nation. Leading this bold campaign was General Winfield Scott, a meticulous and experienced commander who had come to be known as the Grand Old Man of the Army. On March 9, 1847, Scott's forces landed near Veracruz in what was the largest amphibious assault in U.S. history up to that point. The city was heavily fortified, but Scott, ever the strategist, chose to lay siege rather than launch a direct assault. For 20 days, U.S. artillery bombarded Veracruz, inflicting heavy damage and causing great suffering among its civilian population. The Siege of Veracruz was a turning point in the war, showcasing the destructive power of modern artillery and the harsh realities of siege warfare. On March 29, 1847, the city surrendered, opening the way for Scott's march on Mexico City. But the victory at Veracruz came at a cost. Hundreds of civilians had died, and the Mexican resistance, though battered, was far from broken. Scott's march to Mexico City was a daunting task. The road was long, the terrain rough, and the Mexican army, though outnumbered, was determined to defend its capital. Along the way, Scott's forces encountered fierce resistance, most notably at the Battle of Cerro Gordo, where the Mexican army, under the command of General Santa Anna, made a desperate stand. At Cerro Gordo, Scott demonstrated his tactical brilliance, using the rugged terrain to his advantage and launching a surprise attack that outflanked Santa Anna's forces. The battle was a decisive victory for the United States, opening the way to the Valley of Mexico and bringing Scott's army ever closer to its ultimate goal, Mexico City. With each victory, Scott's forces drew closer to Mexico City, but the psychological toll of the campaign was growing. The American soldiers, many of whom were volunteers, began to feel the weight of what they were undertaking. The invasion of a foreign capital, the overthrow of a sovereign government. For the Mexicans, the approach of the U.S. Army was a nightmare realized, a threat not just to their land, but to their very identity as a people. The final phase of the campaign was at hand. Scott's forces, now at the gates of Mexico City, prepared for the decisive battles that would determine the outcome of the war. The Mexican defenders, under the leadership of General Santa Anna, were ready to make their last stand, fighting not just for their capital but for the soul of their nation. Mexico City, the crown jewel of the Mexican nation, was now the final target of Scott's campaign. This ancient capital, with its grand plazas, towering cathedrals, and bustling markets, was a symbol of Mexico's rich history and cultural heritage. But it was also a city under siege, as Scott's forces closed in, determined to bring the war to a decisive end. The defense of Mexico City was a desperate affair. Santa Anna, once again leading the Mexican forces, knew that this was his last chance to turn the tide of the war. The city's defenses were reinforced, and every available soldier was called to arms. But the defenders were outnumbered and outgunned, and the U.S. forces were advancing with relentless determination. The Battle of Chapultepec, fought on September 13, 1847, was one of the most iconic and tragic moments of the war. The Mexican Military Academy, located on a hill overlooking the city, was defended by a small group of cadets, some as young as 13. These Niños Héroes, as they came to be known, fought with unmatched bravery, holding off the American forces for as long as they could. But the outcome was inevitable. The fall of Chapultepec was a devastating blow to Mexican morale. The cadets' sacrifice became a powerful symbol of Mexican resistance and pride, even in the face of overwhelming odds. But for the U.S. forces, it was a sign that victory was within reach. With Chapultepec in American hands, the way to Mexico City was open. On September 14, 1847, U.S. forces entered the city, encountering fierce resistance from Mexican soldiers and civilians alike. The fighting was brutal, as both sides knew that the fate of the nation hung in the balance. But by the end of the day, the U.S. had taken control of the city, and the Mexican-American War was effectively over. Mexico City had fallen, and with it, the hopes of a Mexican victory for the United States. It was a moment of triumph, the culmination of a campaign that had pushed the boundaries of what the young nation could achieve. But for Mexico, it was a moment of deep sorrow and humiliation, a reminder of the price of war and the fragility of national sovereignty. With the fall of Mexico City, the Mexican government had little choice but to negotiate peace. The resulting Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed on February 2, 1848, was a bitter pill for Mexico to swallow. The terms were harsh. Mexico was forced to cede nearly half of its territory to the United States, including present-day California, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Colorado, Nevada, and Utah. In exchange, the U.S. agreed to pay $15 million, a sum that, to many, seemed a pittance for the vast lands acquired. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo redrew the map of North America, transforming the United States into a continental power and leaving Mexico a shadow of its former self. The loss of territory was a profound blow to Mexican national pride and a source of lasting bitterness. For the United States, the war was a triumph of manifest destiny, but it also left unresolved questions about the future of the new territories, particularly the issue of slavery, which would soon plunge the nation into civil war.